Welcome to toy-polloi.
Hello and welcome to another video from toy-polloi, and today we're going to be taking a look at the rest of the first wave of the new retro collection of the Adventures of Indiana Jones figures produced by Hasbro and Kenner. Now, I recently reviewed the Indiana Jones figure, and that was the first figure released in this wave, and I've just had the rest of the wave arrive, which is the other four figures. We have Belloq, we've got Marion Ravenwood, we've got the German mechanic, and we have Toht. So what we're going to be doing today is taking a look at the cards, then we'll open them all up and we'll be able to compare the figures to the vintage original ones that I have and see how they match up. Now, if you've watched my Indiana Jones review, you'll have seen that actually the figures do lack a certain amount of detail. They have very soft sculpts on them, the colours aren't quite right, and I'm going to say straight away you can see that on all of these other figures. There are subtle differences between the vintage original ones and these, mainly to do in how sharp the sculpt is looking and the colour of the figures, and some other small issues, so we will look at all of those as we go. First up though, let's take a look at the cards. Okay, so here is the rest of the first wave. There are 5 in this set. The Indiana Jones is the other figure which I have already reviewed. So we've got Belloq here. You can see he comes on a really nice looking card. These are very reminiscent to the original cards as I showed previously. There's a few subtle changes with the copyright details here, and it does appear that this Raiders of the Lost Ark logo is slightly different as well. So on this card you can see we have Belloq, and he comes with his staff and the little robe and whatever that is around his neck, some sort of ceremonial thing. All of these figures are actually pretty hard to find in the UK, the vintage original ones. The only one I would say is slightly easier to find is Toht. I found him a few times. The other ones are still very hard to find. So I'm actually quite excited to get these 4 figures, because I'll be able to complete some of my sort of vintage collection by having these on display. So there you go. Yeah, that is Belloq. He's not looking too bad. That's probably the best of these figures. The other ones all seem to have a few little issues when we sort of look close up at them. If I look at Marion now, you can see this is not a bad representation of Marion. The fabric used for her skirt is not correct. I can show you the original one later on. She comes with a little monkey there, which is slightly hidden by her skirt, and even through the packaging I can see that the plastic used on the main part of her body is very grey. So you've got nice white sort of sleeves, and the body part is very grey. We'll check that out as we open up this figure. So that's the Marion card. You see Marion Ravenwood there, and a pretty reasonable image there. Toht, yeah, this is the most common vintage figure I find, and he looks pretty good there. I can see there's a few differences on how they've applied the paint. Again, we'll look at that when we take the figure out of the packet. The original Toht had a black head with the pink skin colour and glasses painted on. This looks like the head is actually made out of that pink flesh colour with the black paint painted on for the hat. But look at his gun. It looks all right from the front. If I turn it to the side, you can see it is bent really badly. It's been put in the packaging at a really sort of awkward angle. I sort of mentioned this on the previous reviews of these indie figures. The care and attention of everything about them is lacking, and certainly on packing that is particularly badly packed. So we'll see what can be done with that when we take it out of the packet. And then the final one of this 4 is the German mechanic. He doesn't look too bad. I'm going to say the skin tone is really off. He looks like he's got quite a tan there. But then I suppose when you see him in the film, he's got quite a tan. So maybe the original one was a bit pasty. But again, I will compare those when we get these out of the packet. He just comes with his little spanner there. Again, a little bit on the bent side, but nowhere near as bent as Toht's gun. So yeah, they don't look too bad on card. These again have come on this really flimsy card, but I've heard from some other collectors that they've got these figures, especially the indie figure, and it's come on a much thicker card stock. So there obviously is 2 different versions of these figures. I bought these direct from Hasbro, so this comes from the Hasbro Pulse website here in the UK, and these are the ones that got delivered to me. The indie figures all came on these thin cards, and all of these have come on the thin cards. So I'm not sure how people are getting the ones with the slightly thicker cardstock, but certainly if you order them direct from Hasbro, this is what you get. So yeah, not the greatest of cards. I'll show you the back again, but if you want to see this fully, then check out my indie review. You can see it shows the 5 figures that are in this wave. The original set of Kenner figures had a lot more figures. I think there were 11 in total, 9 that came on cards, plus 2 that were in with play sets. I'm hoping that one day they will do all of the figures, because there are some of the other ones that were in the original sort of lineup that are incredibly hard to get. So I'm hoping that they do all of them. But for the moment, we just get these 5 figures. Now, I can do one slight comparison with these cards, because this is the new release. So this is the Hasbro Kenner version carded, as you can see. And I have here, this is the Stan Solo version that was released a few months back. So this is a reproduction, a fan-made reproduction version of the Marion Ravenwood figure, and this comes on a card that is pretty much identical to the original card, so we can easily spot the differences now between them. So as I say, the Raiders logo is slightly different. You can see that's the original version of the Raiders of the Lost Ark logo, and the one on these new cards has completely different sort of colouring, and it looks like the font is different as well. You can see there's different spacing between the letters, and it's generally very different looking. Everything else is fairly similar. There's more details on the original card because it says that the figure is posable, movable at the neck, shoulders and hips. That has been removed from here on the front of this new card. And then there's also a mail away offer on these vintage cards, because the Belloq figure was a mail away figure as well as being available in limited amounts on cards. So there's a mail away offer there. And if we turn it over, you can see that the original card only shows you 4 figures, because that was what was released in that original wave, plus a couple of play sets and some more information at the bottom about the Belloq mail away figure, whereas the new cards show the 5 figures that are available in this current wave, and then a load of legal bump at the bottom there. So you can see the cards aren't actually too bad. The modern sort of versions match fairly well the original one. There's some subtle differences, and certainly compared to the Star Wars Retro Collection cards, they really don't look bad at all. So let's open up these figures and then we'll compare them to the vintage original ones and see how they stand up. Okay, so they are now free from the packet, and I'm going to have to say straight away from first glance, these are a lot better than I was expecting. I was prepared for disappointment based on the other indie retro figures that I have opened, which have all been on the sort of poor quality side, but these actually are not too bad. There are a few issues with them, but the overall effect of them is they're very nice. There's a few sort of sculpting issues, as I mentioned, some sort of soft sculpting, and a few sort of bent legs and bent weapons. But otherwise, they do look very nice. So let's take a closer look at each one, and I will compare it to the originals that I have, and I'll sort of point out the sort of flaws. But I do have to say, overall, I'm much more impressed with these than I was with the indie figure. They are a lot better. So first up, we have Toht. On the left here, this is the new retro collection version, and on the right, we have my vintage original. And you can see that it doesn't actually look too bad at all. The face is probably the worst part of this figure, but I never really liked the vintage original one. It's got a very strange look to it, and you can see that the new one has lost some of the detail. As I mentioned in the introduction, the hat on this one is actually sculpted out of black plastic, and then the rest of the face is painted on. On the new one, the face is made out of the plastic, so it's made out of a flesh coloured plastic, and they've painted on the hat and the glasses and the eyes, so it's done the other way round. The rest of the figure looks like it's done in a pretty similar fashion to the original one, so it's all black plastic with sort of some small details painted on. Now with the original version, my sort of vintage original one, I always thought that the cape was actually made out of too hard a plastic, so it's actually quite awkward to pose this figure because the cape is made out of such a rigid plastic. On this new version, the cape is made out of a much softer material, so it's very easy to move around, and it means that you can move his arms about. He was always a very limited figure in what he could do, and the one sort of big feature about him is that he's got the burn mark on his hand to show the top of the staff there, and that's a very key point in the movie. So that was pretty much his only sort of role as an action figure, was to be able to do that and do the salute, and it was a little bit awkward because this cape always got in the way. If I show you on my original one, the cape sort of limits a bit what you can do, and it tends to sort of pop off his shoulders. So this new softer material is really very nice. If we take that off, we can then look at the figure, and you can see it is a little bit soft on the sculpt, but overall it's actually not too bad. I think this is probably one of the better sculpts that they've managed to reproduce. There's not a lot of detail in it in the first place, but it's certainly come across quite nicely. And if you look at the cape, you can see we've got all of the belt detail and that. This is actually very nice and sharp, so I'm not quite sure how they've managed to make that so sharp and some of the other figures are so soft on the sculpt. But we do have one major problem, and that is his gun. I'll show you so you can see it on the background. This is how it came out of the packet. It has got a real bend to it, and I've tried to straighten it up and it won't, so I'm going to have to drop that into some just boiled water to see if I can straighten it up, because at the moment he's not shooting anyone. That is quite a wonky angle that we've got there on the barrel of that gun. So that is a little bit of a disappointment, but the rest of the figure I actually think is pretty nice. So that's one I'm going to say is a sort of a win for this wave of figures. He's not the hardest one to get as a vintage figure, but as a modern figure, that's not too bad at all. That's a good reproduction of it. Now we take a look at the German mechanic. So on the right here we have my vintage original one, and on the left we have the new recreation. The original one has the spring-loaded hand that you can see there, and they've done that same mechanism on this new one. It's not quite so springy, but then this figure is very old and a little bit loose, so I would expect this one to be a bit tighter. You can see straight away that he has certainly got more of a tan going on, but as I showed you on the card back, the character actually was fairly tan, so this is probably a closer interpretation of the skin tone. This one is fairly muted. I'm just used to seeing this sort of muted flesh tone colour, so I can get used to that sort of fleshy sort of suntanned look. He comes with his little wrench there, which fits very nicely in his hand. Some of the detail, as with all the other figures, has been lost, so you can see there's a lot of muscle detail on this original one, especially if we turn him around. There's lots of detail on his back. On this new version, that is all a little bit on the sort of soft side, but it's not the worst by any means. He's also got a very pronounced bottom, but then the original one had the same sort of look to him. The only issue I really have with this figure is his legs. They've got a very pronounced bend to them. If we look at this original one, they stand relatively straight. These legs really do bend in, and you can see the bottom of his feet aren't even flush. So he's a little bit more awkward to stand up because of that. They may be sort of fixable if I again put this in some just boiled water like I got to do with Toht's gun, but yeah, initially he's going to be a little bit awkward to stand up, but he's not a bad figure at all, and this one is fairly hard to find here in the UK, so yeah, he's certainly going to be worth picking up if you don't have a vintage original one. It's not a bad figure at all. Now we come on to the ceremonial version of Belloq. This figure originally was a mail away figure, although I think there are a few carded versions as well that were available, and I've never actually found one here in the UK. This guy came from the US, and this is all I have of an original Belloq. I don't have any of his outfits, so we're just going to have to sort of guess and see if we think that this does match what the vintage original one looked like. The actual figure itself is not too bad. You can see mine has got rather a lot of damage to his face, but you can actually see if we compare them, it's not too bad at all. They've managed to get most of the sort of detail to come across in that face, and it never particularly looked like the actor, so I don't think that's too bad at all. He comes with this really nice looking staff, which has got sort of a little ram's head detail on the front of it there at the top, and that fits very nicely in his hand. Then we've got this sort of ceremonial thing, I don't know what you would call it, that sort of hangs around his neck. That is quite nicely made. Got a little bit of sort of pearlescent paint put on the top of it, and it's not too bad looking at all. Then we've got his robes, which I think do work fantastically well. I've been trying to recreate that myself to finish off this figure, and I've never found a material that matches, so it looks like they've printed this material. I would have thought the original one was probably on a sort of looped fleece type material, so this material may not be quite accurate to the original one. But the overall effect of it does look very nice indeed. And then we've got a bit of ribbon tied around his waist. If we lift this up, you can see the underside is pretty good actually. There's a fair amount of detail on this one. His legs are a little on the loose side. You can see especially at the knee joint there, they do bend, but they are a little bit on the loose side, and I've certainly had trouble trying to rotate his legs fully up. They seem very tight in the joint, like I would imagine that you could probably snap those off if you twisted that too many times. So I'm a little bit cautious on the legs on that one. Let's try my vintage one, see how he stands up. Yeah, the legs, there's no sort of wobble in the knee there, and you can actually rotate his legs quite freely. So yeah, I'd be a little bit cautious just about moving the thigh joint on that one, but otherwise I think this one is looking really nice indeed. And because he's such a hard figure to find in the UK, I don't think I've actually ever seen one here in the UK. I'm very pleased to have this one. This is going to go straight with my collection of the vintage figures. They've done a remarkably good job with this one compared to the indie figure. I think this one really does look very nice indeed. And finally we come on to the Marion figure. Now I don't have a vintage original one, but what I do have is a Stan Solo version, and if you've seen any of these Stan Solo reproduction figures before, you'll know how good they are. They are so close to the original. So this is what I'm going to be comparing this modern Hasbro Kenner version to, because I know that the Stan Solo version is an incredibly close match to the original. So this is the Stan Solo version, this is the modern Kenner retro collection version. It's not too bad, I have to say. The overall effect is it does work quite well. As I mentioned in my sort of intro, you can see that the body though is a much grayer coloured plastic, so it's not a pure white, whereas the Stan Solo one, they've really managed to match the colour completely. So I've got a lovely pure white vest there, and then the sleeves are the same colour. This one, you can clearly see there's a different tone to the plastics and the paint used, so that's a little bit disappointing. Also, the face details, the actual sculpt is not too bad. You can see they've managed to capture most of that. The paint application is a bit sloppy on the Hasbro version. There's a bit of overspray, there's a bit of underspray, whereas the Stan Solo one, they've managed to capture that really very nicely. It's much sharper. And then we come down to the skirt. Now, the Hasbro version, they've not managed to get the correct material. In fact, this is not even close to the original one. This is what the original material should look like. So you can see it's got a fine sort of weave to it and fine detailing. This one, they've basically just gone, what's close, that'll do. It seems like they really didn't bother about sort of making this a perfect match. So certainly the Stan Solo version is much closer to the original one. If we take the skirt off, we can see underneath how this looks. The legs on this figure have always been quite thin, so she's not the easiest of figures to stand up. There's a little bit of a bow there to the leg. If we look at the Stan Solo one, that doesn't have the bow. So again, this is sort of plastic quality issues. I might be able to fix that by putting it into some just boiled water and seeing if I can straighten that leg out. And then if we look at this skirt, we can see how that's made. It's actually made really quite nicely. I think the Stan Solo one, though, they've gone to that extra level. You can see here there's just a bit of fabric underneath, a sort of underskirt. On the Stan Solo one, that's even got some hemming going on, which I would imagine will be a copy of what the original one was like. So the Hasbro version, they've sort of done a cheap, as close as they can get version of this skirt, and it does the job, but it's nowhere near what the original one was. So yeah, so I think that goes for a lot of these things. They've done the bare minimum when it comes to some of these figures, and this one certainly feels like they've done a little bit of the bare minimum on it. It could have been made a lot better, but it's certainly not too bad. And again, it's another figure that's pretty hard to find, so if you want one of these in your collection, this is going to be a very good option, because it's certainly not perfect, but it's really not bad. Let's take a look at the monkey that she comes with. So here is the monkey accessory that she comes with. This is the modern version, the Hasbro Kenner version, and this is the Stan Solo version. And I have to say, in this instance, it doesn't happen often. I think the Kenner version has more detail to it. There's slightly more detail in the sculpt, and you can see a little bit more of what's going on with the monkey. The Stan Solo version is really good, but it's not quite there compared to that. That is very unusual. As I say, on all of the modern figures, they seem to sort of cut corners, but for some reason this monkey has come through and it looks really nice indeed. You can see we've got a little waistcoat painted on and a couple of little eyes. I don't know if you can just about see those painted on, little black dots where the eyes should be. So it's quite a unique little accessory, and certainly from a key point in the movie, I think that's really not badly done at all. And there we go, there are the 5 figures from this wave. I think compared to the indie figure, these 4 figures certainly look a lot better. There's still a few issues with them, especially things like Toht's gun. That is crazy, the fact it's got such a bend to it. But they can be fixed. I can put those into some just boiled water and I should be able to straighten them up. Whether you should have to do that with a brand new figure straight out of the packet is another issue. I think there certainly are some quality control problems when it comes to making modern action figures, and Hasbro or Kenner, you know, do have some serious issues when it comes to that. These are $14.99 each, or that's how much I paid for them when I bought them off the Hasbro website, and for that much I'd expect a higher quality figure straight out of the packet, so it is a little bit disappointing. But you're not going to be able to find the vintage original versions of these here in the UK, so they are a very good option, and even at that price they're a sort of a good value option to get these figures in your collection. I'm certainly going to be buying the rest of the figures that come out. I've already reviewed the part of Wave 2, the Temple of Doom figures, so do check that out. I'm just waiting for the other figures from The Last Crusade to arrive, and I will review those as well. Overall, I've been really enjoying these figures. it's just let down by some quality control problems, which I think, you know, I've mentioned many times. It's the same with the Star Wars figures, the Star Wars Retro Collection figures. They just don't show enough attention to detail, and it's such a shame because these figures are essentially aimed at collectors, and collectors do tend to have a much higher standard that they want for the figures that they're putting in their collection. So it is a real shame, but they are worth getting. So if you're thinking about getting these figures, I would grab them now because I can't imagine they will be around for long. Once they're out of stock, I don't imagine that they will make any more of them. I'm really hoping that they do finish all of the original figures because there's only 11 in the set, so we've got 5 so far, so they only need to make 6 more and we can have the full set of those retro figures. So I really do hope that they do that. If you've enjoyed this review, then please check out some of my other retro collection reviews of the indie figures and also of the Star Wars figures. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and tap the bell to be notified each time I upload a new video, and thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching toy-polloi. Subscribe for more great videos. You can also follow toy-polloi on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.